Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, delivering essential insights and hopefully a truly informed perspective for you. Today we're embarking on what we're calling a reconnaissance briefing. Our mission for you, our discerning listener, is to really dig into some foundational questions, questions that strike right at the heart of American governance. We're talking about presidential authority, the actual capacity for leadership, and crucially, the integrity of federal institutions. Now, our primary source material for this deep dive, it's some powerful and frankly, pretty astonishing testimony. It comes from hearing before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary titled Unfit to Serve, how the Biden cover-up endangered America and undermined the Constitution. That was on June 18, 2025, and we've meticulously pulled in related reports, analyses, other sources mentioned there, just to give you the most comprehensive and balanced picture possible. Our goal, as always, is to deconstruct these complex layers, extract the key insights, and distill clear lessons for you. So let's dive in. We're going to start with something that seems, well, incredibly simple on the surface. The presidential signature. For centuries, it's been the mark of authority, right? That final personal stamp.
The ultimate sign-off.
Exactly. On everything from pardons to signing major bills into law. It signifies the president's direct assent, their choice, their endorsement. But, in our modern era, with technology advancing, especially with things like the Autopen, well, this simple act suddenly gets complicated.
Layers of complexity, constitutional complexity even.
Right. It raises profound questions about legitimacy, even, who's really in charge. The core concept here, as laid out in the sources, is that while the manual personal signature is what we expect,
it's the baseline.
The use of a facsimile like an autopin has become this huge point of contention. It turns a routine administrative detail into something much bigger.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, how this seemingly mundane tool, the autopin, can raise such fundamental legal and constitutional questions. Professor John C. Harrison's testimony really brought this out. He outlined how the Constitution gives the president numerous powers, and time and again these are exercised through signed documents.
Signing bill.
Exactly. Article 1, Section 7, for signing bills. The inherent expectation, the bedrock principle, is that the president personally signifies their choice, their specific assent to that action. Harrison then went into the legal frameworks, specifically citing the 2005 Office of Legal Counsel opinion, the OLC.
From the Department of Justice.
Yes. And that opinion concluded that, okay, the president can sign via facsimile, like an autopin, but, and this is crucial, only if the president clearly and explicitly signifies their wish for that specific document to be signed that way.
So the intent has to be absolutely clear.
Absolutely. And even more critical, the OLC was crystal clear that the fundamental decision to approve and sign a bill, that could not be delegated.
Non-transferable.
It's the president's personal prerogative.
Oh.
Only the physical action of affixing the signature after the decision is made could be delegated. It's a nuance that often gets, lost in the shuffle, but it's legally central. The president still has to be the decider.
Okay, so if the OLC was so clear that the decision itself is non-delegable, where does Congress fit in? How can they ensure this distinction is actually, respected when an autopin is used?
Well, that's central to Professor Harrison's argument. He posits that Congress actually has substantial power here, power to regulate the process of affixing the president's signature non-manually.
Ouch.
He points straight to the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8, the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers of any department or officer, including the president. But Harrison emphasizes what scholars call the horizontal necessary and proper clause.
Meaning
Congress isn't just making laws for itself, but laws to ensure the other branches, like the executive, execute their powers properly, accountably. The purpose, he argued, is to ensure a clear, verifiable documentary record of the president's assent.
So transparency.
Legitimate. Exactly. It facilitates presidential power by making its exercise transparent and legitimate. Critically, though, without directing the president's actual policy choices.
Congress isn't saying what to sign, just how to record it authentically.
Precisely. To maintain public trust and legal clarity. And to make this practical, Harrison suggested Congress could legislate a requirement. Require another official, maybe a senior White House staffer, an appointed officer to prepare and certify a document.
Certification.
Yes, an official record stating their personal knowledge of the president's instruction to use the autopin for a specific document. It would need to detail the circumstances, a phone call maybe, or a secure video link, and confirm the instruction referred to the exact document.
And make it public.
He argued it should be published, places like the Federal Register, for transparency, for accountability. He even suggested Congress could let the president appoint certain staff as inferior officers just for this ministerial function, making it a legally binding act.
That makes a lot of sense, legally and for transparency. But okay, let's shift from the should be to the what was.
Yeah.
The sources suggest a pretty different reality in practice, right? How much was the Autopen actually used, and on what?
Yeah, this is where the analysis gets quite revealing, particularly Theodore Wold's testimony, drawing on research from the Oversight Project. Their findings suggest the Biden White House used an autopin extensively, frequently.
How extensively?
Well, the details are pretty stark. It was reportedly first used just 5 days into the administration for a proclamation, and their research indicated at least 3 different autopin signatures were in use throughout the tenure.
3 different signatures. Suggests a system.
It does. And Wold highlighted some particularly sensitive actions signed this way. Clemency warrants, for instance. Out of 51 issued, the research found over half 32 were autopin signed.
32? Wow. Not just routine stuff then.
Not at all. These included highly controversial decisions, death row commutations, even preemptive pardons.
For who?
For figures like members of the Biden family, Dr. Anthony Fauci, General Mark Milley, some issued right at the end of the term. Wold's research also pointed to autopin use for clemency and executive orders, even when President Biden was physically in Washington, D.C.
In D.C., so he was available.
Apparently. And even more striking, on days when he did manually sign, they call it wet signing, a bill into law, the autopin was still used for other documents labeled important records.
Okay, that raises the obvious question. Why? If he could sign one thing manually.
Why use the autopin for other critical documents on the same day? That's the question hanging in the air.
So what's the implication of this widespread, sometimes seemingly, arbitrary use? What's the core concern they voiced?
Wold's testimony really cuts to the chase. He states bluntly that using the autopin this way divorces the president's signature from what it is expected to represent, the president's assent and endorsement. He argues it poses significant constitutional, legal, and practical concerns.
More than just practical.
Oh, yes. And he had this quote that really stood out. By using the autopin, anyone can sign documents as the president himself. The implication is profound. Without clear, documented, verifiable presidential direction for each specific use.
The authenticity is questionable.
Severely compromised, and therefore the legitimacy of the policy itself. It's not just a convenience tool. It's a potential bypass of the president's personal authority. And then Senator Cruz provided some real compelling data that underscores this exact point.
What did the data show?
A dramatic shift. In 2021, President Biden issued 78 executive orders, none by autopin, 0.
Okay, so manual was the norm initially.
Clearly. But then, after July 15, 2022, a complete reversal. 100% of executive orders issued in the rest of 2022 were autopin signed.
100%. That's stark.
It is. And the trend continued 2023. 16 out of 24 EOs auto-in. 2024. 14 out of 19. And by 2025, according to this data, all 14 EOs issued autopin.
So the critical legal question becomes, if a staffer uses that pen without explicit real-time authorization for that document.
Is that action legally legitimate? Is that law actually passed? Is that order valid?
And the implied answer from the testimony?
A resounding never. It highlights the absolute necessity of ongoing specific presidential direction and assent. It's not a blank check granted by the president. Sean Spicer's testimony added another layer, contrasting this with President Trump's perceived accessibility.
Implying it was clearer who was in charge then.
That was the implication. Spicer described it as consistently clear who was running the country. This comparison implicitly suggests a perceived lack of similar transparency or direct communication about autopin use in the Biden White House.
Leading to questions about who is really making the call.
Exactly. Were these decisions fully engaged with by the president himself for each specific instance? It speaks to a potential disconnect.
So what we're seeing based on these sources is the autopen becoming more than just a tool. It becomes, as they characterize it, this potent, troubling symbol, a symbol for many of an absentee president, raising profound questions about whether the executive branch became effectively a government run by committee.
Rather than by the single leader chosen by the American people.
Precisely. And that symbolic power, that question mark over the signature, it serves as a really vital bridge to our next theme, which goes much deeper, frankly, into more unsettling territory, the question surrounding presidential capacity itself. If the signature is in doubt, what about the mind directing it?
Right. So moving beyond the mechanics of the signature, the executive process questions, we now pivot to these far more profound and frankly quite disturbing questions about presidential capacity and the constitutional implications if a leader is perceived to be in decline. This isn't just about a pen, it's about the core ability to do the job.
The commander-in-chief's ability to perform extensive, demanding duties.
The sources present this as potentially a constitutional crisis. It really demands our full attention.
And what's immediately striking, as Sean Spicer highlighted, is the perceived contrast in media treatment.
Regarding presidential fitness questions.
Exactly. He pointed out that former President Trump faced, in his words, baseless inquiries into mental fitness. He recalled specific headlines from major outlets questioning Trump's stability back in early 2018. CNN, Washington Post, Vox, NBC.
Those were mentioned. But Spicer argued the media scrutiny for President Biden was, quote, wholly absent, despite what he called deeply concerning and public signs of decline. He specifically noted the media's silence on calls for Biden to take a cognitive test, something requested vocally of Trump.
A perceived double standard.
That's how it was presented in the sources, yes, raising questions about journalistic impartiality in this specific context. And Senator statements reinforced these concerns, citing very public moments.
Like the June 2024 debate.
Yes, that was cited as pivotal. Describing President Biden appearing frozen behind the podium, mouth agape, eyes frozen and unblinking. His speech characterized as confused and disjointed.
That's a vivid description from observers.
It is, and the analysis also revealed a quote attributed to Senator Cornyn from a book by Jake Tapper and Alex Compson, Original Sin. The quote essentially admitted that what the world saw at that 2024 debate wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural result of an 81-year-old man whose capabilities had been diminishing for years. That's a remarkably candid admission, especially given the source.
And this was contrasted with official White House statements.
Sharply. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre's claim that President Biden could run circles around her was presented as a significant disconnect from these observable realities, portrayed as part of an effort, perhaps, to downplay or conceal his condition.
So if there are these public signs, these descriptions, even admissions like the Cornyn quote, what was the underlying allegation about why this wasn't perhaps more widely acknowledged or acted upon sooner?
The core argument running through these sources is stark. An alleged, deliberate conspiracy to hide the president's true condition.
A conspiracy involving whom?
Multiple layers, according to the testimony. His family, his immediate staff, parts of the media, even elected officials accused of complicity through silence or misrepresentation. Theodore Wohl linked this back to the Autopen, voicing concern it might have been used to usurp presidential power or to conceal the president's decline.
Turning a tool into a shield.
Or potentially worse, Wold explicitly stated the administration, specifically the vice president and cabinet, ignored the 25th Amendment.
The very mechanism designed for this situation.
Precisely. Senators in the hearing used strong language, constitutional crisis, even the greatest deception in our nation's history. They focused on Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, the pathway for the VP and a majority of the cabinet to declare the president unable.
And the claim is they didn't use it.
The critical point emphasized was that they did nothing, and this inaction wasn't framed as oversight. It was alleged to be driven by political and personal self-interest, not acting in the good faith the amendment demands.
Prioritizing politics over constitutional duty is the allegation.
That's the essence of it, and Senator Blackburn added a particularly, jarring detail, an alleged statement from a Biden staffer suggesting Biden just had to win and then he could disappear for 4 years, only needing to show proof of life every once in a while.
That's chilling, if accurate. Suggests calculation.
Deeply cynical calculation, if true. And Senator Hawley pointed out how Democrats who initially vouched for Biden's sharpness and capacity changed their tune dramatically after that debate. Some publicly calling it elder abuse, concluding they'd been, quote, lied to us for 4 years. This shift amplified the concerns.
These are incredibly serious allegations.
Yeah.
If there was this leadership vacuum, what were the reported consequences? Who was making the decisions?
The consequences, as described, were significant failures and faltering.
Such as?
Examples cited included the border crisis claims of 15 million illegal entries, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, tragically costing 13 American lives, and rampant inflation hitting everyday Americans. all attributed in this testimony to a rudderless administration.
And the question of who was in charge?
That was the central, chilling question posed repeatedly by Senator Cruz. Who was running the country? His own answer, I don't know. The fear expressed was that nameless, faceless aides, maybe a cabal behind the curtain, were making critical decisions, pushing a radical wish list, fundamentally undermining the principle that the president, elected by the people, should be the one directing policy, a potential shift of power to unaccountable figures.
Which raises huge moral questions for those inside, doesn't it? Staffers who might have observed this.
Absolutely. Severe moral dilemmas. Professor Harrison suggested staffers should go to the vice president, who has that specific 25th Amendment authority. Theodore Wold offered a more nuanced take, acknowledging the pressure, suggesting maybe conversations with trusted colleagues, prayer, or even resignation if confrontation wasn't possible.
And Sean Spicer?
He asserted a profound moral obligation as an American, as a citizen, as a human being, for anyone who knew the leader couldn't make critical decisions, urging them to follow the chain of command, but speak out if necessary, duty to nation over personal loyalty.
Did this lead to discussion about fixing this for the future? Guardrails.
It did. Potential reforms were discussed. Things like clearer definitions of unable in the 25th Amendment itself, as it's currently quite vague. Senator Tillis floated an idea: an annual attestation from Senate-confirmed cabinet members to Congress about the president's mental fitness, maybe under penalty of perjury.
Adding formal accountability.
That's the idea. Though Harrison had reservations separation of powers concerns if Congress mandated it, but he conceded if presidents adopted it voluntarily, it could boost public confidence.
A public record of fitness assessments.
Right. And Spicer suggested the president's personal physician should be held publicly accountable for affirming fitness, make their medical opinion a matter of public record and accountability.
Okay, this brings us to our final theme. It extends beyond the White House, looking at federal agencies, even data reporting. Here, the focus shifts to allegations of political manipulation within law enforcement and how government data was handled. Things that, if true, strike at public trust in impartial institutions and the info you, the public, receive.
Yes, the analysis reveals some really significant claims here. Allegations of a politically driven conspiracy among anti-Trump FBI agents and prosecutors. Designed, it's alleged, specifically to target President Trump and his associates.
What specific investigations were mentioned?
Arctic Frost was one, which ultimately became a Jack Smith case against Trump. Also, the investigation into Peter Navarro, the former advisor, and key figures were named: FBI Special Agent Walter Giardina, Supervisory Special Agent Blair Tolman, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Timothy Thiebel.
And what were the allegations against them?
Pretty disturbing ones. Giardina allegedly stated openly he wanted to investigate Trump, even if it meant false predication, starting a case without a real basis. He's also accused of wiping his assigned laptop improperly, raising immediate red flags about data preservation.
Covering tracks.
That's the implication. And allegedly instructing agents to use false emolument clause predication against Trump suggests a deeply concerning level of politicization, if true. Thiebel allegedly violated the FBI's own no self-approval rule. A supervisor isn't supposed to create and approve their own case, avoids conflicts of interest. Senator Grassley's investigation reportedly made public emails proving this violation, adding verifiable evidence. The testimony further alleged Jack Smith's deputy, J.P. Cooney, actively sought more cases against Trump, reportedly justifying it by citing partisan news outlets, not objective investigative reasons, suggests political influence.
And issues with fairness in the legal process itself.
Yes. A miscarriage of justice was alleged. Biden prosecutors reportedly failed to provide key exculpatory emails helpful to the defense, later revealed by whistleblowers to Trump's counsel.
That undermines a fair trial directly.
Absolutely. Grassley's investigation also reportedly found the FBI used prohibited access status on some Crossfire Hurricane files, potentially restricting access for other agents, Congress, even the Inspector General, raises questions of obstruction, concealment.
A pattern seems to be emerging.
And another detail. Nellie Orr of Fusion GPS reportedly made false statements to Congress, but the FBI and DOJ allegedly chose not to press charges. This decision was contrasted with the pursuit of other cases. All these actions together were presented as exposing a cultural rot within the FBI and the DOJ's leadership, suggesting, in the words of one senator, they acted like a Democratic National Committee's echo chamber, compromising their impartiality.
That's a truly grave accusation against core law enforcement bodies. But the sources also raised concerns about government data, specifically crime stats, right? How that was handled.
Yes, moving to another critical area of public trust. Government data reporting and alleged media complicity in, perhaps, misrepresenting it. The analysis points to a really troubling pattern with the FBI's handling of its final 2022 crime data. Initially, the FBI reported a 2.1% fall in violent crime.
Which sounds like good news.
Right. And according to the sources, it quickly became a Democratic Party talking point to counter claims that crime was rising. However, the revised data, updated quietly later, showed a completely different picture.
Not a fall.
A 4.5% increase in violent crime for 2022. A significant dramatic reversal. This revision added huge numbers. Over 80,000 more violent crimes tallied, including almost 1,700 more murders, nearly 7,800 more rapes, over 33,000 robberies, 37,000 aggravated assaults.
Huge numbers. And the FBI announced this revision.
Critically, no. The testimony states the FBI made no mention of these major revisions in its September 2024 press release. The updated, less favorable numbers were apparently buried deep on their website. You had to dig for them.
That seems opaque.
Experts quoted like Carl Moody and Dr. Thomas Marvell expressed deep concern. Lack of explanation for these huge changes makes it hard to trust the data. Jeffrey Anderson, former head of the DOJ's Bureau of Justice Statistics, stated flatly his agency definitely would have highlighted such a massive change in a press release. Standard transparency practice.
Was this FBI data consistent with other measures?
That's another key point. A stark discrepancy emerged when compared to the Bureau of Justice Statistics' own survey, the NCVS, which asks victims directly about crime. For 2022, the NCBS found a 29.1% increase in violent crime.
29% versus the FBI's revised 4.5%. That's enormous.
A massive difference. And for 2023, the NCVS showed a 4.1% increase in reported violent crime, while the FBI reported a 3.5% drop. This persistent discrepancy, plus the media's initial focus on the inaccurate FBI data and then silence on the revisions,
Makes it hard for the public to know what's really happening.
exactly, presented as making it difficult to see how crime rates have changed. The implication: inaccurate data was used, perhaps intentionally, by media and politicians to convince the public they were wrong about rising crime. Senator Blackburn asserted the media was part of the ruse, part of the fraud. It paints a deeply concerning picture of how critical public info can be potentially massaged or selectively presented.
Misleading citizens about their own safety, the state of the nation. These findings, taken together, they have really profound implications, don't they? It's not just about individual incidents. It suggests systemic challenges.
Absolutely. If we connect these threads, the autopin, the capacity questions, the alleged agency issues, what emerges is this consistent and frankly deeply troubling pattern. A significant erosion of public trust and accountability across vital areas of governance. The Autopen Presidency, as it was termed, it symbolizes that potential disconnect between the president and the actual execution of policy, raises fundamental questions about authenticity, about direct presidential assent.
Especially when capacity questions are layered on top.
Exactly. It becomes amplified exponentially. The true source of authority for major decisions becomes ambiguous, murky. Then, the alleged cover-up of presidential decline highlights a perceived failure of our constitutional safety nets, like the 25th Amendment. It suggests that individuals in immense positions of trust may have put political or personal interests ahead of the virtuous conduct expected, impacting critical national decisions.
It really speaks to the character required in public service.
It does. And then the allegations of weaponization within federal law enforcement, the manipulation of public data. These directly undermine the rule of law, fairness, public confidence. If law enforcement is seen as political, if public stats are massaged, the whole foundation of informed public discourse just crumbles.
And this directly impacts you, the listener.
Immensely. It clouds the true state of leadership, the accuracy of the information you rely on, makes it incredibly hard to form objective conclusions, which leads to that critical question. What are the real consequences when the very institutions meant to protect and inform you are perceived as engaging in obfuscation, maybe even political maneuvering?
Okay, as we wrap up this reconnaissance briefing, let's distill the essential lessons from this deep dive. What are the key takeaways for you? First, it seems absolutely clear. We need unambiguous, verifiable presidential assent for official actions, especially as tech like the Autopen proliferates. Right. Robust, transparent documentation isn't just nice to have, it's fundamental for legitimacy.
A baseline requirement for public confidence.
Second, the profound challenges raised by questions of presidential capacity. They demand a serious reevaluation of how the 25th Amendment actually works in practice. And, crucially, a look at the moral obligations of high-ranking officials to act in the nation's best interest, even when it's politically difficult.
It goes to the core of ethical leadership.
And third, maintaining the credibility of federal law enforcement and data agencies requires unwavering political neutrality, absolute transparency, especially when dealing with political figures or reporting critical public statistics. They must not only be impartial, but be seen to be impartial.
Trust is paramount and easily broken. And to leave you with a final, maybe provocative thought to consider. This analysis suggests these aren't just isolated issues or simple partisan squabbles. They seem to be interconnected challenges hitting at the very foundations of American democracy, which leaves you with a critical question. In this age of information overload, intense political polarization, how can you, as a citizen, effectively discern truth? How can you hold power accountable? Especially when the institutions designed for transparency and oversight are themselves under such scrutiny, facing these allegations of compromise. What does that mean for civic engagement, for informed decisions, for the future of self-governance itself, when trust in these fundamental functions erodes so significantly? That's a question I think we all need to grapple with as we navigate the path ahead.